Welcome to Robert Bellissimo at the Movies, where we explore all things cinema. I want to welcome back to the show Joseph McBride, who is a film historian and former professor in the School of Cinema at San Francisco State University. He is the author of biographies of Frank Capra, John Ford, and Steven Spielberg, three books on Orson Welles, and critical studies of Ernst Lubitsch, Billy Wilder, and the Coen brothers. He acted for Wells in The Other Side of the Wind and has won a Writers Guild of America award. And today we are discussing one of his books, Frankly Unmasking Frank Capra. Joseph, welcome back. Always a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, it's great to be back, Robert. We always have great talks, so thank you very much for having me again.
Anytime. And this is part two of our first talk on Capra. Last year, we talked about your biography on Frank Capra, which came out in the early 90s. And now, so we have this memoir of your experience writing the book.
Mhm.
So can you talk a little bit about what about this time period made you then want to turn that whole story into another book?
Well, I'm in kind of a memoir phase of my writing life, which a lot of writers get into, and a number of my books have elements of memoir. My Kennedy assassination book, Into the Nightmare, is a memoir of my 31 years studying that case, and um, my collection, Two Cheers for Hollywood, which has a long memoir of my Hollywood years, and frankly, is a memoir of working on the Capra book, etc. And I'm working on an interview book for Sticking Place Books, Paul Cronin's imprint, which Michelle Simon and Jonathan Rosenbaum have done books for, and Jim Naramore is doing one, and I'm doing a book about my career. He's doing a series on film historians and critics, and Danny Perry is doing the interviewing. He's an old pal of mine from college, and a very good author of film books and baseball books. My first book was on baseball, so we have that in common too, and that's kind of fun. So it's an interesting thing to go over your life. But the Capra book was a watershed in my career. I think probably it's the best work I've done. I mean, I put 7.5 years of hard work into it, and I did the best I could humanly do in researching his life, and I found out many things. One reviewer said there's a surprise on every page, and that's really true. That Capra's life, which people thought they knew, was not actually very well known because he had created a myth about himself with the help of the media, and people hadn't really done the research to inquire whether the myth was accurate. But I co-wrote the American Film Institute Life Achievement Award show about Capra in 1982 with the producer George Stevens Jr., and I got to know Capra better then. And but the first time I met him was in 1975. I interviewed him for Daily Variety, and I was interviewing all the directors I admired, and I admired his work greatly, and I still do. I mean, I actually kind of admire it even more now, despite all the negative things I learned about his character. I understand where the contradictions and complexities of the films come from, and they're not all Capra too. That's one of the things I discovered, that Robert Riskin, the screenwriter, is as much the author of the films as Capra is, if not more. But when I interviewed Capra, he took me to a posh country club in the Palm Springs area, and he was giving me his rap about how he hated bankers and rich people, the whole little guy against the system thing that people like in his work. And a man came over to the table and said, "Frank, here are the pictures of you playing golf with President Ford." And he handed Capra a bunch of pictures. And we looked at these, and Capra was going, "Oh, isn't this wonderful? Geez, Jerry is such a funny guy. And when he hits the ball, it goes all over the place." And there was a particularly amazing photo of President Ford holding the pin while Capra putted. And I thought that's the ultimate immigrant dream. The president holds the pin while you putt. And Ford was the only president who invited Capra to dinner at the White House, Capra and his wife Lou, and that was a big deal for Capra. He had been to the White House to see Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, but he hated Roosevelt. He told me that's a whole story in itself. Capra turned out to be very different from what I expected, and the first clue was when he interrupted his, anti-establishment tirade to fawn over playing golf with the president. And then he turned to me. The guy said, "I'll have copies made for you." And Capra said, "Great." And he said, "Where was I?" He said, "Oh, yeah, I was telling you how I hate bankers and rich people." And he just kept going without an interruption. And I flashed on the fact that this is a big act that he's putting on, and he's a phony. Basically, it
Right.
really revealed that to me. And I made a mental note at the end of the interview, find out more. And it took me 9 years before I launched my biographical journey. And by then, I'd gotten to know Capra pretty quite well from working with him on the AFI show. I wrote his acceptance speech with him for the end of the show. George Stevens Jr. said, Capra's not a good public speaker, so the show will rise and fall on the quality of his speech. And so I spent 2 months with him writing and rehearsing the speech over and over again. And we worked on it very carefully. And I didn't know that he had brought in a ghostwriter too. This is typical of Capra, that he would bring in pages and I would bring in ideas, and then we melded it together. And it turned out to be a wonderful speech. And Liz Smith, the gossip columnist, said when Capra talked about his family at the end of the film, and said the last line was, "But for America, just for living here, I kiss the ground." And she said, "I haven't cried so much since Bambi's mother died," which I thought was wonderful. But I got to know him, and he said, "What can I do for you now?" And I said, "Well, I'd like to get to know you better. Come down to La Quinta, where he lived. That's near Palm Springs." And so I started going down and seeing him, and I began putting together in my mind the idea of writing this biography. And it took until '84. I had to leave the film business to do this and clear the decks. I was getting very disenchanted with the film business, and I finally. But it's hard to separate yourself from it. Capra said filmmaking is like heroin addiction. It's so hard to kick.
Right.
And I finally did, and I spent 7.5 years in this book. 4 of the years were spent on a legal battle to get the book out, and I won the battle, but it was quite a difficult Kafkaesque saga, and that's what I write about in Frankly Unmasking Frank Capra. I waited a long time to write it because I wanted to put it, it's what Wordsworth calls emotion recollected in tranquility. It was a very painful, emotional period of my life, but triumph in a ultimate way, because the book came out in 1992 and was well received. But I had tremendous opposition from my own initial publisher, which was Knopf. Random House was their parent company. And the editor was the illustrious Robert Gottlieb, who is considered the greatest modern book editor. He edited Catch-22 and all kinds of other books, especially Robert Caro's works. The Robert Moses book is the best nonfiction book I ever read, along with Boswell's Life of Johnson. And when I started my Capra book, Robert Caro's first volume on Lyndon Johnson had just come out, and that helped me to. It was a model of how to approach a biography. And Caro's still working on his fourth and final volume on Johnson. So I thought things were going to go well because I had this great editor, but he wound up being very compromised and betrayed me. And he had entered into some kind of a deal with Janine Basinger, who's the Capra archivist at Wesleyan University, and she's now semi-retired, but she's still on the campus, and she's no longer the head archivist, but they have a building named after her now, et cetera. And she was at first promising to give me any help she could, and she let me look at Capra's papers before anybody else had seen them. When I was doing the AFI show, I went back in '82 to look at the papers for 4 days, and we actually opened the boxes together. They hadn't been opened, and I made great discoveries. Within half an hour, I had my theme, because as a journalist, I have good instincts for, contradictions and where a story lies. And in Capra's autobiography, which most people were beguiled by, and I thought it was very, fascinating, and people tended to believe it, and I kind of naively believed a lot of it. There's a jarring section when he goes to India in 1952. on behalf of the State Department to represent the U.S. at a film festival. And his mission was to counter the communist influence at the festival that the government felt was bad. And India was what they called a non-aligned nation, very important to our relationship with the world. And so suddenly the book becomes very strident, and this very kind of one-dimensional anti-communist tirade goes into it. Capra's quoting his diaries, and I thought, wow, that's kind of jarring. Here's this guy. I thought he was this defender of freedom of speech. But one of my favorite films has always been Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, which is a great defense of the First Amendment and other rights, and it's a powerful and serious attack on corruption in Washington. It was written by, I found out, a communist screenwriter. Sidney Buchman was actually a member of the Communist Party when he wrote it, which is fascinating. It's the greatest American patriotic film. And Costa Gavras, who made Z and Missing and other great political films, said it was Mr. Smith is still the best political film ever made. It's the model for all of us, he told Capra. And Capra was very nervous about it in later years and tried to disown it, ironically. But I got him to admit that's his best film. He usually told people It's a Wonderful Life is his best film because that's what they want to hear. But he said, no, Mr. Smith. And I said, why do you think that's your best film? He said, because it's bigger. It's a story about our country and how it functions, which I agree, you know. But I asked a person who knew Buchman, how could a communist write this, you know, the greatest patriotic film? And he said, well, he was an American communist. It was a great line. And the Communist Party in 1938 had the line, the slogan was, communism is 20th century Americanism. And they had decided the main thing was to get the country to go to war against fascism. And Roosevelt was trying to drag the country into fighting Nazi Germany, and the country was very isolationist, and it took Pearl Harbor to change people. And so they were focusing on the Bill of Rights. Instead of trying to be divisive about economic issues, they were defending the Bill of Rights. And so Buchman could do that, and he was passionate about it. He was later blacklisted, and I found the big revelation I found out about Capra was that he informed on some of his colleagues during the blacklist period. And I discovered that within 30 minutes of when I went to Wesleyan, we went down the basement, started opening boxes, and I asked for the box for January 1952, and I figured that's where I would find interesting things. And within 30 minutes, I found the story. I found this document Capra had written, 225-page document he called his security board file, because he was part of a top secret think tank at his alma mater, Caltech, called Project Vista, as a Defense Department project to study what to do if there was World War III in Europe, basically. And he was head of psychological warfare filmmaking for this project, and he wrote various things, goofy ideas for propaganda films, because he had made the Why We Fight propaganda films for the Army in World War II. And so he was called to service. But then his security clearance was revoked because they found claims that he was disloyal, which is stunning, because nobody was more patriotic than Frank Capra, who was an immigrant from Sicily, and he truly loved America deeply, and he tried to make himself over into 100% American, but there is no such thing. You know, none of us can say that except Native Americans. And here's a guy from Sicily who wanted to deny his roots, which I came to realize was a big part of his problem in life. And anyway, I found out he was an informer. I read this document, and he named names to a body called the Army, Navy, Air Force Personnel Security Board. This was part of the government's loyalty program that Harry Truman had initiated. People call it the McCarthy era, but you know, McCarthy didn't discover communism as his major topic until 1949, and the House Committee on Un-American Activities was formed in 1938, and they had their big Hollywood hearings in 1947. And Harry Truman, president, had instituted this loyalty security program under right-wing pressure. So it was a bipartisan effort to investigate people. It's very much like the world we're in today. And It's interesting that George Clooney is on Broadway doing Good Night and Good Luck, which
Yeah,
is
yeah.
about Edward R. Murrow, battle
I
with
quite
Joan.
like that film too from 20 years back.
Yeah, I watched it a couple days ago. I thought I want to
Yeah,
watch this film, and boy, it's a powerful film, about McCarthyism.
really
And
good.
Murrow stood up against McCarthy belatedly, but he helped destroy McCarthy, and
Yeah,
it took quite a while for them to muster up the courage to confront this demagogue, but they did, and then his bluster collapsed. He committed the chutzpah of attacking the U.S. Army, which is kind of suicidal. And then he threatened to investigate the CIA, which is even more suicidal. And so the 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 establishment rallied against him, and Murrow, was the leading broadcaster. And anyway, so we're in a kind of a period now with authoritarianism and blacklisting, and all kinds of bad things are happening, and our government's stability is questioned. And but here is Capra in the middle of the post-war Red Scare, and so I made this discovery, and I made the mistake of telling Janine Basinger, Jay, I found this document. Capra says he's an informer, and I mean, it shows him informing to the government in the document. And I shouldn't have told her, because she started hiding documents. When I went back in '84 to go through the papers, that document had disappeared. And among other documents that I had told her about, I was too open about things back in the day. When you're writing a book, you should be, as John Ford called, inky. Inky. He told his grandson to be inky. That's an intelligence term, meaning to be covert.
right.
Don't you don't advertise what scoops you're finding. And plus, I had to find out the whole story and context. And in other words, what makes a person an informer? And I realized the roots of that are in childhood. And I quote a poem that Graham Greene quoted by the poet A.E., who wrote that in the lost childhood of Judas, Christ was betrayed. And that's really profound. And I studied Capra's childhood in great detail. And at the time I started doing this book, and I go into the research, which I think people will find interesting. How do you research somebody, Frank Capra? There's a tremendous amount of paper trail on all of us, I discovered. And I got a hold of his Army records, his school records, with his help. He was somewhat cooperative. Um, and I got about the only two things in his autobiography that are actually true are the date he was born in Sicily and the date the ship left for America. But I checked everything. It was good discipline. I couldn't take anything at face value. I got his birth certificate from Sicily, and the date was correct. And I went to Washington and got the manifest of the ship. Every ship that came into America, there was a manifest listing all the passengers and their addresses and destinations and all kinds of stuff. And I found the manifest, and it checked out. And I showed it to Capra because there was a Sinatra on the boat and a Coppola, which was
Oh, wow.
interesting. And he said they can both go back, as far as I'm concerned. He didn't like either of those
Oh,
guys. There's a whole story for each one, but I checked everything, and I got the census also. 1910 census was the latest one they had at the National Archive, and that was the period where Capra was a boy on the east side of LA. And I discovered, for example, he says I was in an Italian ghetto with all these people who thought alike, and they, he really was negative toward his own people. He was negative toward every ethnic group you could mention. Black people, Jewish people, Native American people, you name it, and even his own people, he put them down. But I found out it was not an Italian ghetto; it was a multi-ethnic neighborhood, and he said they were all poor, and that wasn't even true. They all had houses. The Capras actually owned 3 houses. I went into the
wow.
records in LA. They had 3 houses. They did quite well. I mean, they were not, wealthy, but they were modestly doing well. And it had the names of all these people. So I went through the LA phone book laboriously to try to find these people. And I found some people who went to grade school with them and playmates. And But then I found a lot of people who went to high school with him, which turned out to be a really important period in his life. And I found out who they were by getting in touch with the alumni director there, and this woman who was the class historian of Capra's class. She was the 18th person I interviewed from his high school, and she gave me the clue. Capra wrote in his book he had a wonderful time in high school, and most of the people I talked to didn't remember Capra, which I was kind of frustrated by. But then Janine Basinger, one of the few good pieces of advice she gave me was, well, she said, maybe that's the story, that he
Mm,
was ignored. And it turned out that
right.
was the story. He was this immigrant guy with poor clothing and a shabby looking guy. And he was the janitor at the school. He cleaned the blackboards in the morning to help put himself through school. And, but he said, you know, we all got along great. And everybody told me this stuff until I reached this woman, Esther Schlinger, the class historian. She said he was a nice boy, but he was a terrible wop. WOP, which, you know, is a slur against Italians.
Right.
Terrible. I was shocked. And she said nobody would play with him or nobody would date him because he was, you know, an immigrant, and we looked down on him. And actually, though, she dated him. I mean, I got the sense because she kept talking, and, you know, I kept egging her on, and she would tell me how he would come to her house. Capra came to her house, and her parents disapproved of her hanging out with this immigrant guy, but they were both interested in photography, and they both were on the mandolin club and things like that. So there's a girl that paid some attention to him, but she looked down on him at the same time. And so I went back to Capra and I said, here's what Mrs. Schlinger said. And he said, well, they were right. He said, I was looked down on, I was ostracized. Nobody would, very few people would socialize with me. The girls wouldn't go out with me. They all looked so pretty. And he said, there was I with cardboard shoes. I remember he said that. And but I started my research by interviewing Jimmy Doolittle and his wife, Joe Daniels Doolittle, who was the valedictorian in Capra's class. And Jimmy Doolittle is a famous name in American history. He won the Medal of Honor for bombing Tokyo in 1942, a famous exploit. And he was a pioneer aviator. And then he became the head of the 8th Air Force, all kinds of distinctions. And they were great people, wonderful people. And it turned out they were in contact with a lot of their school chums, you know. And he actually knew Capra well. He was an egalitarian kind of kid. And he said we were all kind of from modest families and we got along well. And they're both on the tumbling team. They're acrobats. They were both little guys, but they were tough, you know.
Mm,
And so they were really helpful. And anyway, so I go into how I researched this, and then I interviewed something like 18 men who went to Troop Institute of Technology with Capra, which later became Caltech. And that was a happy experience because at Caltech was all boys, and they all were kind of treating each other well. And it's kind of like when I went to high school, we got along great because it was more intellectual camaraderie, and they all respected Frank, and he was a hard worker. And but he was a good student. And one of the myths that endures about Capra is he got a BA in chemical engineering at Caltech and then couldn't get a job as a scientist, so he became a filmmaker. And that is, you know, it doesn't seem all that important, but it's actually an important thing. He did not get a BA in chemical engineering. He got a general BS, which was the lowest degree they gave you, which was still an achievement. But he wasn't qualified to be a chemical engineer. He started taking the advanced classes and couldn't hack it. And it was partly because his father was killed in a farm accident during his junior year, which I actually found an eyewitness to it, which is a great piece of discovery. And
right.
wow, what a shocking event. And then he also found a girlfriend that year and started neglecting his studies. And I found the girlfriend. Another thing he did was he denied that he had girlfriends in college. He said, I was working, I only slept 5 hours a day. I was working all the time. And he claimed his family didn't help support him, which was a lie. To his mother and sister worked and sent him money to help go through school. And I found a class paper he wrote called Personal Efficiency. And he said, you know, I've got to get more efficient because I'm sleeping 9 hours a day and I'm playing billiards too much and I'm smoking and got to start studying more. Completely different from the bullshit that he puts out in his book about what a great student he was. And so he barely made it through college, but he got a college degree. And he said he discovered poetry at Caltech, which was actually the big discovery for him. There was a poet in residence, Alfred Noyes, a well-known British poet, and his English teacher. All the guys told me their favorite teacher was a man named Clinton Kelly Judy, who was the English teacher. And he had these guys who were engineers writing short stories, and they all loved it, you know, and he was trying to make them well-rounded people. And one of the guys said, "Oh, you should have heard these stories. They were really something and ridiculous, but we all had fun writing them." And this is the guy they remembered the most, and he helped Capra enormously. And I found out that the heroes of his life were school teachers. There were three of them. The first one was a lady named Jean McDaniel, who was a tall Irish spinster lady, as they would call them in those days. And she wore these high boots, and she would sit on a stool in front of the class in fifth grade. And one of the moments when I cry when I read my book is she gave an interview, and she said one day in class, little Frank was looking over the shoulder of the girl in front of him, and she said, "Frank, why are you doing that? Don't you have a book?" And he said, "No, Miss McDaniel, I don't have a book," because the family couldn't afford books, or they didn't want to pay for books. And she said, "I interested the PTA on his behalf, and the parents wanted to pull him out in fifth grade and make him go to work in a brickyard like his brother Tony. And if that had happened, we never would have heard of Frank Capra." But she said, "We
Mm.
got the PTA to pay his parents what he would have earned working in a brickyard." Can you imagine this? Because he was such a smart little boy, you know. And she got him books, and she kept nagging him, "Go on to high school, go on to high school." Not every kid did that. And then he went to high school, and there was another teacher who was an amazing influence named Rob Wagner. And in his book, he doesn't say much about these people. And Rob Wagner was a guy who was writing articles for the Saturday Evening Post about how to break into the movies. This is 1915 thereabouts, you know, when he graduated. And Wagner was writing scripts for Max Sennett. And I found out, you know, Capra got into movies partly because Rob Wagner helped get him entree into the Roach Comedy Company and the Max Sennett Company. And Wagner directed films later, and he had his own film magazine, and, you know, an amazing guy. So these are the three heroes of his early life who made him what he was. So anyway, I had wonderful times interviewing people. But one thing that when I studied film biographies at 1984, most of them didn't bother interviewing so-called ordinary people. They interviewed mostly movie stars who didn't. Movie stars don't know a lot about the production of a film. They come in and maybe they're there for 2 weeks or a month, and they're more focused on themselves and their roles. The people who know how a film is made are the crew. And so I started with Capra's loyal crew guys, and they gave me a very different portrait of how Capra worked from what he claimed. And I also, when you do a biography, you start with the oldest people first and the people who were in poor health. I started with Joe Walker, who was Capra's cameraman on 20 films, and he was 92, and he gave me great interviews. And then the other crew guys were eager to talk because Capra had slighted Joe Walker in his book, and they all felt that was terrible, you know. They all
Yeah.
loved Joe, and he was a great artist. Um, but I interviewed a lot of ordinary people because I noticed Robert Caro in his Johnson book, he takes like 40 pages before Johnson appears in the book, and it's mostly about the women in the hill country of Texas. And before Johnson brought electricity to the hill country, what these women's lives were like when they did the laundry, for example, is a big account of how difficult it was. And this really brings alive what a politician could do for his people. And yet Johnson did it through corruption. That's the complexity of his life. He did some good things, but with corrupt means. But anyway, the film biographies would interview 8 or 9 people and no so-called ordinary people, and they would rush through the first 18 years or so of the person's life until he got into movies or she got into movies. And I spent as much time as I could on the early period because that's where his character was formed and warped, basically. And I loved talking to those people. I learned a lot about the history of that period. Anyway, so I'll let you interject here. Sorry, I'm going on about the. I got
No,
excited
no. I
about.
mean,
Yeah.
it's you know, it's fascinating how much went into how much detail you put into the book, and then and into the biography, and then equally into the memoir. Everything you went through. I mean, every detail is so fascinating, and it's this is very interesting to me with Janine Basinger, how she seemed to really have this hold on on Knopf, the publisher.
Mm.
And what now, unless I missed it, but did you ever find out as to why she was able to influence them so much over you? I mean, you had a really juicy story on your hands. I was
Yeah.
God, why would they have let this woman do this?
Yeah, when I talked to the press, I didn't tell this story back in '92. I was willing, but nobody really asked. But you asked a great question because I don't know the whole mystery to that. How was this archivist, kind of
Yeah.
obscure at the time, able to control a major publisher in America? She somehow compromised Knopf. And I had offers from three publishers, and I went with Gottlieb. But I was telling her all about, the negotiations, again, that was not smart. And she's insinuated herself with Gottlieb, and they became friends. They started going around together, and he wrote about her in his autobiography, Avid Reader, which came out a few years ago. He's since died, but he talked about
Yeah.
how they would travel around to archives and watch old movies, and they had a lot of fun. He said, "The laughs," and I thought, "The laughs, geez," they were buddies. And he called me a few months after I started doing my book, and he said, "I just wanted to alert you to something we're publishing a book by Janine Basinger called the It's a Wonderful Life book," which came out. And that really shocked me because I had warned him that she was withholding documents, and I told him all about this security board file. And he said, "Don't worry, when the time comes, I'll get that document for you." And he said, I'm going to be in kind of a funny position editing your book and her book on Capra, but I can do this. And he said he edited Gloria Vanderbilt's autobiography and a book called Little Gloria, Happy at Last, which was kind of a critical book about her. And he was proud that he could juggle these two books. But it was a compromising situation. And I was really upset that he was in business with her. And then he published Capra's autobiography, reprinted Capra's autobiography, which was shocking as well. And I mean, I knew that the book was not going to be published by Knopf when in 1986 they put out a press release about her Wonderful Life book, saying it was the definitive book on this classic film. And first of all, how could they say that? I'm writing the biography that's supposed to be the
Right.
definitive work on Capra, and I just knew that they wouldn't publish my book at that point. But my wife, Dr. Ruth O'Hara, who's an important person at Stanford University, was the great hero of the book, who made the book possible. Was very supportive in every way, and also very shrewd legally. She helped me all through the complicated legal situations and the psychology of these people. And part of this is the psychology. Your question: how did this archivist get control over this major
Yeah.
public? Somehow she compromised them, and I don't know all the details, but I have some suspicions, and I report what I can piece together. Um, they managed to compromise my agent too, who was corrupted by Knopf, and I had to fire him. And I finally got a great lawyer who was another hero of the case, Maurice Mealy, in 1989, and Ruth and Maury saved the book. And we had to take the book to another publisher, which was Simon and Schuster. It took me a whole year to extricate the book from Knopf, and I wound up having to pay Knopf some money to release the book, which galled me because of all the suffering they put me through and the expenses and everything. But I did, and I found an honest editor at Simon Schuster, Bob Bender, an important editor, and they published the book. But Janine Basinger had promised that I could quote whatever I wanted from Capra's unpublished works, and she had told me Wesleyan controlled the copyright because Capra and his wife had given not only the papers but the rights to Wesleyan, which is true. And then she started denying that they had the rights. I had to get permission from Capra, which was false. but she was manipulating Knopf, and I spent years on the phone with not only Gottlieb and another editor, but the chief lawyer at Random House, who was very hostile. And I could tell that he felt that somehow they were in a very compromised position. And it was, I go into, it's a 600-page book. It's kind of, I, I said that Capra's autobiography is like a captivating novel about Hollywood. It's not accurate, but it's a novel about, he kind of rewrote his life as a Frank Capra movie. And I kind of joke that my book is like a Russian novel, like a Dostoevsky story. He's a
Right.
Dostoevsky character. And so this book is kind of like a Kafka novel. I read the trial again. I did
Yeah.
the audio commentary on Welles's film of the trial, and it's very Kafkaesque
Yeah.
that you're in this situation where people won't tell you things. They wouldn't tell me who the lawyer was for Wesleyan, for example, which they were violating their contract right and left, because in the contract they're supposed to notify the author if there's a legal challenge to the work, et cetera, and they were hiding a lot of things. And when I went to Simon and Schuster, the Wesleyan lawyer called up again. They started trying to corrupt Simon and Schuster, but Simon and Schuster was honest and couldn't be corrupted. And I said, "Who's their lawyer?" And they told me right away. They weren't concealing anything. Um, but there was some kind of unholy alliance that Basinger and Gottlieb had gotten together. Gottlieb, after a while, abruptly left Knopf to be the editor of the New Yorker, and this caused quite, is on page 1 of the New York Times. It's a big story because it caused an uproar at the New Yorker that this guy came in, and so he became kind of scarce. But he still kept his hand on my book to some extent. But I had a new editor, and but they were stuck in this situation. There, it was hard for them to tell the truth and to deal with it honestly, and so it became this battle of nerves and chess game and legal battle. But I finally, I was in the right, so I knew I would ultimately prevail if I could just hold out. And they were trying, as my lawyer said, it's terrible what they're doing. They're trying to starve you into submission.
Right.
Because what happens when you do a biography, I got a pretty good advance, but I knew it was nowhere near enough to write a long book because, I'm more ambitious than the advance would indicate. And so I had to pour a lot of my own money into the book, by doing other jobs and things. And but I started selling back parts of the book that I owned. For example, first serial rights,
Yeah.
which I had in my contract. You can publish it in part of it in a magazine. That caused them great trepidation. Whenever I needed money, I would say, I'm thinking of selling the first serial rights, and they'd send me some more money. And then I finally had to sell the first serial rights, which deprived me of some control. I was
Mm.
holding it over them, and I sold some foreign rights and this and that. But we were really poor, and it was tough. And I was working on this book for years, and Ruth was a graduate student at USC, and
Did
uh,
that ever distract, because as I'm sure you would, it's common that when people have severe financial issues, it could be hard sometimes to even focus. I mean, did that ever rattle your all the focus you needed to write this book, or?
well, I'm good at concentrating and focusing. Although there were the hardest thing was long stretches where nothing would happen, like Christmas would come and they'd all go on vacation. I'd be sitting there and like,
Yeah.
I just wanted to get this book done. And the one benefit it had was I kept polishing the book, and it's polished to the degree, the best degree that I could possibly make it, because I kept rewriting and revising. And then when I finally, to get the book out, I couldn't quote the unpublished material because she reneged on her promise. And so I had to, I told the Random House lawyer I would paraphrase it. He gave me one good piece of legal advice. He said, don't paraphrase, summarize. He said, we don't like the word paraphrase because that implies something that might be too close to the original, and you
Mm.
can't, you could violate copyright if it's too close to the original. But so I would summarize the content of Capra, letters and manuscripts Capra wrote. But I had more than a year of interviews with Capra, so his voice is heard throughout the book. And I got to ask him all kinds of questions. And plus, I could quote letters that he wrote when he was a U.S. government employee, for example, because those are public domain. But two bad court cases came down while I was writing the book, which changed things. The Salinger case and the L. Ron Hubbard case were both copyright cases that limited the rights of authors to quote unpublished letters and other material by authors. And conservative judges basically clamped down on it. It used to be when you wrote a biography, you could go find letters in archives and quote, substantial amount of a letter, but they made it really hard to do that. And it got to the point where, each publisher has their own advice to authors, how much will let you quote unpublished material. But in this case, it was so dodgy that I just decided I couldn't quote anything that was property of Wesleyan. And so I had to summarize, and that took 3.5 months. I took a leave of absence from Variety. What saved this book, as Ruth said, was when I got a job on Variety in 1989. I had been on Variety twice before, and it's the last thing I wanted to do is go back to being a trade reporter. But it saved the book because I was getting a good salary for a change, and I was able to start getting out of debt. And
Right.
they couldn't starve me into submission anymore. I could pay my lawyer, and I could, survive and hold out. And that's what saved the book. And
Mm.
things started happening at that point. Plus, there was a change of management at Random House, et cetera, and various things happened. But I was just extremely strong and determined, and I had a good lawyer and my wife behind me. And I'm good at. One of the books that's influenced my life a lot is Richard Nixon's memoir, Six Crises, which came out in 1962. And he wrote about his life in terms of crises that he had gone through. And it's melodramatic way to look at your life, but it's true. Politicians go through crises. The Chequers speech and the Hiss case or one thing or another. I mean, I disagree with most of Nixon's politics, but I found the book really interesting. And I've gone through about 7 crises now, and I always win because I have this tremendous determination and ability to withstand
Mm.
abuse. And I'm tougher than they are, and I survive these things. And I'm writing about
It's
that
like
kind
it's
of
like
thing.
a Capra film within itself. I wonder if anyone ever told you that this book,
Oh yeah.
frankly, is like a
Well, I've had several offers over the years and feelers and offers to make this into a
ah.
film or a miniseries, and I've turned them all down because it fills me with absolute horror to think of this book being
Mm.
turned into a film or a miniseries because I fought so hard to have control of it. I wouldn't want to surrender control to anybody, and so I keep rebuffing offers from people. But it is a dramatic story, and
Yeah.
this book, frankly, is I think of as basically volume 2 of the biography because it's somebody actually 2 people said things late in my research. One person, Charles Chaplin of the LA Times, who was a friend of mine, I offered him part of the book to serialize when I was trying to raise money, and he said, instead, why don't you write a essay for the Times called "How I Found Frank"? Tell us how you researched Frank. Chuck was very sympathetic, and that kind of made me think, well, that's a good story. And that's a part of Capra's story, is how a biographer came into the picture, and he worked with the biographer to some extent. And then he tried to, Capra put up some resistance and some cooperation. Some members of his family were very cooperative with me, but some were not. His 2 sons were difficult, and his daughter wouldn't talk to me. But somebody else said to me, you should write a final chapter about the biography. This is part of Capra's story, And I thought, well, I didn't want to go into it then because I wanted the focus to be on the biography itself, not on how the struggle I
Yeah.
have. But I was prepared to talk about it, but nobody asked about it back then. Um, but I began thinking, yeah, the story of the biography is part of Capra's story, how he tried to thwart um, the deconstruction of the myth that he had created, which is a huge part of his life. And so I felt that I was, one thing that kept me going was I felt that, well, part of it was the craft. I love the craft of writing, and that kept me going. But also, I was creating the wheel of Frank Capra's scholarship, I felt, because it was all based on false premises, because everybody who wrote about Capra, almost everybody, took his autobiography as gospel, and then they would extrapolate from that to his films. But ironically, I found out he didn't actually believe in what his films were saying very much. It was more the writers who gave him these
Yeah.
ideas, these liberal ideas. Capra was a Republican. He wrote the government. He said, I voted the straight Republican ticket since 1920, which means that Capra voted for Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover twice, Alf Landon, Wilkie,
Wow.
Dewey. I mean, Nixon
Yeah.
was, I mean, he was a hardcore Republican, and people mistook him for a liberal humanist, and he was not a liberal humanist. He was a bigot, and I mean, he sat there and he spewed a lot of abuse. He started blaming the downfall of his career partly on Jewish people in the industry, and some
Mm.
shocking anti-Semitism. And ironically, though, he had worked with Jewish writers, and Robert Riskin, for example, Joe Swerling, and Harry Cohn, the head of Columbia, who he had a combative but creative relationship, was Jewish, and he worked harmoniously with those people. And then his first wife was Jewish, Helen Howell, who's an actress who I came to really like. I never met her because she had died before I did my book, but he had nothing good to say about her. And one of the things he held against her was she liked his family. Can you believe this? Helen
Mm.
was nice, egalitarian, Jewish American actress who loved Frank Capra's kind of homey peasant family, and would sit around and drink wine with them and have a good time. And Frank despised all these people. And I
Mm.
thought, wow, geez, I like Helen, and the relatives I talked to said, yeah, we really liked Helen. She was really nice. She was nice to the kids. And, it was a tragic story. His first wife,
Yeah.
she had an ectopic pregnancy, which means the fallopian tube, the,
Yeah.
the conception occurs in the tube. It's a life-threatening thing, and she couldn't have children, and that hurt the marriage. But Capra hit her. He told me this vicious story on the day that his silent film Long Pants premiered. He was fired from the film by Harry Langdon, so he was very upset. And he wanted her to go to the premiere with him, but she was drunk. He said she had a drinking problem because he neglected her, basically. And so he told me how he hit her very violently. And oh God, it was a shocking thing. He told me a lot of very revealing things.
He
And
must have wanted to have been found out, if to have told you all this and have all his papers donated to. He must have wanted someone like you to eventually to get rid of his guilt. I
yeah, I
just can
can't.
only speculate, but I
Oh,
wonder. I
I
wonder what you think.
speculated on that too. I felt that he was confessing, whether consciously or
Mm.
not, by
Right.
giving his papers the evidence of his guilt, of informing, giving all that. Not only the security board file, but related documents and letters and things, and clues, and correspondence, and his diaries. He was unburdening himself, which is actually kind of a mark in his favor. I began thinking morally, well, there's an interesting question. Kazan informed on people and did it very openly, and uh, kind of took the heat for it, and was, considered a villain by a lot of people. But he did it in public, and he wrote what seems to be a fairly honest autobiography. But
Yeah.
you never know until you do the research. I have to do the caveat. But
Right.
Capra, on the other hand, concealed it because he was ashamed of it, and I was trying to figure out which is morally better, to hide your crime or to confess your crime. Obviously, I think Capra is a Catholic, and I come from the Catholic Church, although I left it behind when I was 19. And one of the reasons I left it, I didn't like confession. It was really a painful process, but it's an integral part of being a Catholic is confessing. But Capra didn't confess in public. He hinted at certain things, but he um, he confessed by giving the paper. Also, um, I said to him, how come you don't think, why do you think there aren't very many good biographies of film directors? He said, because they didn't have a wife who saved everything like mine
Right.
did.
Right.
which is
Yeah.
interesting. I thought about that. Mrs. Capra Lou was a very nice lady, and she was a secretary. And Frank said, you know, she's the secretary. She organized my papers, but I began thinking that, you know, she seemed extremely loyal to the point of a flaw. You know, she was too loyal and maybe not a good influence on him because she didn't stand up against him when he did disastrous things. But one of their friends said it would make a good movie. It's a wonderful wife, you know. Every wish of his she would carry out, but she preserved his guilt. And, you know, that's maybe an
Right.
act
Yeah.
of subconscious aggression, active subconscious aggression. And so Capra confessed in a sense, but he also led a double life his whole life. And I came along and revealed all this.
Mm. I also watched the documentary you're in, Frank Capra's American Dream, and Richard Schickel, who you write about in your book. One thing that you know, he because as you know, Capra always said one man, one film, and neglected his
Mm,
collaborators. And Schickel was that he brought that up at one point, and he said, "Oh, he's right about that." And I thought, how could a film
mm.
historian and a critic um, say that and
Yeah.
neglect the collaborators? Did you ever ask him about you? I know you had a lot of problems with this documentary naturally, but did you ever ask him why he would say such a thing, or do you have any
Schickel.
sense to? Yeah,
I never really got to know Schickel very well, although I worked with him on the AFI did a series on TNT called, what's it called? 100 Years, 100 Movies. They picked the best movies in each genre, supposedly, and I wrote the section on war films, which we call War and Peace. I borrowed the title from Tolstoy. And Schickel was the executive producer, and he wrote the introductions, which were embarrassingly pretentious. Um, and I was in a meeting with him. He really didn't like me because, you know, he defended Capra and he thought I was a terrible guy for exposing Capra, et cetera. Schickel and I both come from Wauwatosa, Wisconsin, which is a suburb of Milwaukee, which is kind of interesting. We're both there, but we couldn't be more different because I think Schickel was a very corrupt figure. I mean, one of the things that I thought was appalling about Schickel, he was Time Magazine's principal film writer for a long time, and yet he was taking money from the studios for making
all right. Yeah, you
documentaries.
mentioned that in the book.
He
Yeah,
made a lot of documentaries on the side promoting various filmmakers, and some of them are kind of interesting, but he also wrote books about people like Clint Eastwood and Scorsese, et cetera.
yeah,
So he had
Kazan.
access to these people and he made money off it. I mean, that's really you know, corruption. So he was a very corrupt figure, and so he defended Kazan's informing, for example, in his worthless biography of Kazan. And Capra, he wrote a little book about Capra that kind of whitewashed Capra too. But no, I didn't want to, you know, get into an argument with him. He's a ridiculous figure. But um, you were asking a question that was kind of related to that. What was it? It was an interesting.
I just thought it was, I mean, I imagine he likes he maybe Basinger is like as well. Like they like to keep their myths uh,
Oh yeah,
in
yeah.
their mind. And it seems as though he, like you said, he defends Kazan, he defends Capra at all costs. It seems as though the director is everything to these people, and I just like to me that's just baffling from a historian, as himself as a critic and a writer and
Yeah, and Janine Basinger
yeah,
has an inflated reputation as this wonderful lady who's this film historian, and she writes very gushy books of film history, all for Knopf, by the way. She's been a Knopf
right.
author ever since, so she really had something. They really
Oh
liked
wow,
her. They really liked her there, but I could tell they
yeah,
felt under her control too. I mean, at one point, I took meticulous notes all the way through all my phone calls and everything. And Gottlieb, at one point early on, he said, Janine may veto it, referring to my book. And I thought,
wow,
it didn't quite, I didn't quite get the whole picture back then, but when I look back on that, I thought that's quite a thing to say that Janine could veto my book. You know, that I realized what their scheme was to get control of my book and have her edit the book and remove the parts such as about Capra being an informer and maybe the parts about him being a bigot, whatever, you know, damaged the myth and or kill the book. I mean, I think they basically wanted to kill the book. I was sent that message in different ways. But they had to be careful too about violating their contract, so they had to be circumspect. But they were trying to get control or destroy the book, and I obviously was doing everything I could to fight it. But they were trying to get me off the book. One of the last straws was after the second editor died. They had a new person was assigned to be the editor of the book, and they didn't tell me who she was. And I found out by sleuthing around a woman named Bobby Bristol, and I called Bobby Bristol, and I put on this sort of faux cheerful act. I said, "Hi, I'm one of your authors, Joe McBride. I heard you're going to edit my Capra book." And there was this very long pause, and she said, "Oh, well, that hasn't quite been decided yet." And I said, "Well, this other department told me you're the editor." And another long pause, and she said, "Well, yeah, I'll probably work on it with this other guy, Ash Green." Ash Green was one of their senior editors, and he was the only mensch I found at Knopf. He was a good guy. And at one point, right after that call, I called Ash Green. I said, "Mr. Green, I never met you, but this is ridiculous, outrageous. Can't I just get this book back?" And he was very sympathetic and very gentlemanly. And I read that he was considered a honorable gentleman by people in the book industry. Not everybody is honorable. I mean, part of what happened was, I really didn't like working as a writer in Hollywood, where they treat writers terribly. And I thought publishing business is better. I found out it's awfully corrupt too. However, the film writer has no control over his work unless you're somebody like a Neil Simon, who, is so
Yeah.
powerful they could have in their contract. But the average writer in Hollywood is just a writer for hire. But when you have a book contract, you do have control over the contents. They can't cut things out or rewrite things without your approval, unless there's something libelous or whatever. And uh, so the writer does have more rights in publishing. But here's an example of how, a lawyer in Hollywood once said something to me. He said, "You place too much faith in the written word." We were talking about contracts. And I said, "Well, that's kind of an amazing thing for a writer to say, because you guys negotiate contracts." And he pointed out, you can have a contract, but are people going to live up to it? It's just like the Supreme Court today.
Right.
People say the president has to follow what the Supreme Court says, but Trump quotes an apocryphal comment by Andrew Jackson saying, "Well, let them enforce it." Apparently Jackson never said that, but I mean, a lot of this depends on people following the law, and Knopf was not following the law. But when people violate the law, you have them over a barrel to some extent. And that's what I mean by knowing that I was in the right. But, uh, so in other words, they failed to control the book. But Janine Basinger has this motherly aura, which
Yeah.
I kind of fell victim to that too. She can be very charming, and she's on all kinds of interviews, and she's in
Yeah.
those Capra documentaries. There's another one called Frank Capra, Mr. America, that came out last year, which unfortunately, I'm in both of these. And the first one was a real whitewash. So
Yeah.
I didn't want to be in the second one. And the director is a young guy from the UK who called me, and I said, I was fooled into being in the first one, which was produced by Frank Capra Jr. and his brother Tom. But they didn't tell me that until after I'd done my interview. And then they whitewashed Capra. And I said, "I don't want to be in another Sony documentary." And he persuaded me in a long phone call that he was going to do it right, and he would tell the truth. And he said, "I'll have you and Janine Basinger give different points of view." And but then I saw the film, and it's sort of the Janine Basinger and Sam Wasson show. He's a film biographer who's a protege of hers, and they're all over the show. And it kind of takes their point of view too much, and it does some slippery things with facts. It does admit that he was an informer. I mean, that's an improvement, and I get to say a few things, but um, I wish I hadn't been in it. But my feeling about that is the old saying, "Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me." It's my fault for being in that stupid film. But I won. But she has this reputation, and my book was reviewed favorably in Sight and Sound, and they mentioned her chicanery. But it kind of amazes me that she's still considered an important film scholar after she's trying to stop a book by another scholar, it should be considered really
Did she
something.
ever comment on this book? Did she ever
No,
say anything to you or anyone else? No, she
no,
just said nothing.
no, no. She's
Okay,
intelligently staying out of the fray, I guess,
right.
because it could only make her look worse if that's
Yeah,
possible. But
yeah.
not as many people have read my book as I wish, because I'm trying to get the truth out. And it's a warning, a cautionary tale for other biographers. I made some mistakes and fell into some traps, and
Mm,
I ran into a corrupt publisher, et cetera. And so it's a warning story. I talked to a friend of mine who was a biographer who later won the Pulitzer Prize, and I quote him in the book as saying, "This is the worst story I've ever heard," and it's just astonishing, and it's like a
wow.
complete nightmare. And I was interviewed by the New York Times, which gave the book a great review. It was the lead review in the New York Times book section, and a reporter interviewed me about how I had found Capra. I told that story that I told you about meeting him at you know, for lunch and the photographs. And he said this is an amazing book that he said nobody will top it or nobody will touch the subject for 30 years. He said, you've done a great job of research, and, he just was really
Mm,
impressed. So it got great reviews, et cetera. But Janine Basinger's career motors along, and they named a building after her. Then I guess some people don't care. I guess one of the points I want to make there is that there are a lot of people who are Capra fans who don't want to know the truth. They love
yeah,
the myth. They love the myth of
right.
this feisty little guy who came to America and represented the American dream. And, his films are wonderful, stories about America, but they're full of political contradictions. I mean, one of my favorite stories about that is American Madness, which is a terrific film he made in
Oh yeah,
1932.
yeah.
It's his first film that is really politically conscious, and it was written by Robert Riskin. And he lies in his autobiography. He said, Riskin and I concocted the story. Completely false. What happened was um, Harry Cohn, Columbia Pictures depended on the Bank of America, their principal financier, and the Bank of America was in danger of going under in 1932. Banks were failing right and left, and Bank of America was, if they had gone under, Columbia would have gone under. So he assigned Robert Riskin to go and interview the two brothers who ran the Bank of America and write a story about a heroic banker or maverick banker who's gives loans on character, not capital, and he's a man of the people. And Walter Huston played the part. It's a really good script, but a different director was assigned to the project. Capra was on his honeymoon when Riskin wrote the script. Capra had nothing to do with the script, and Alan Dwan started directing the film, and he was fired after 4 days because crew members told me that Dwan was doing a lousy job, and Harry Cohn, they said, liked to take a director off the project sometimes to shake things up. And then another director came in, Roy William Neal, shot for 1 day until Capra could take over. And Capra changed the set, made some important, he made it a 2-level set, which helped visually a lot. And the only thing he added to it was a silent bank robbery sequence, which is really terrific. But otherwise, he filmed the Robert Riskin script. And what the film advocates is a fluid currency. And this was part of Franklin D. Roosevelt's campaign in 1932, because people were hoarding their money. And I mean, this is very, very applicable to today. They were hoarding their money in cash because they didn't trust banks.
Yeah,
And one of the best things Roosevelt did when he came in was to start the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which insured your money. So if the bank went under, the government would pay you, up to $250,000 of what you had in the bank. And that was a huge thing. And, but Capra, one of the people who worked on American, well, actually, this was Forbidden, another Capra film. Adolphe Menjou was in it, who was one of the biggest right wingers in Hollywood. And
oh yeah.
he and Capra were talking, and this person told me they were both bad mouthing Roosevelt, and they were talking about how they were keeping their money in gold because they didn't trust banks, you know, and that's completely contrary to the theme of American
Right.
Madness, which is don't hoard your money. And I found out Capra was hoarding his money at home under his mattress and in closets and stuff because he didn't trust banks. So
Right.
he didn't believe in the theme of his own movie, American Madness, and then he tried to take credit for it in his autobiography. And that's the kind of thing Capra critics believed him. Oh yeah, Frank Capra. But it was very important for him to take credit for that because that inaugurated the political themes that became central to
Right.
his work. You know, the little guy against the system, the maverick, and stopping a run on the bank, which he repeated that sequence in It's a Wonderful Life, for example. And
Yeah.
another important film, the other important film that helped make Capra's career was Platinum Blonde, which Robert Riskin
Oh
had.
yeah.
He wrote the
Yeah.
final script of that.
Really
Um,
good.
came out the year before American Madness, and that was the prototype for films like Mr. Deeds Goes to Town. It's about a working class guy who's a newspaperman who marries a rich woman and is seduced by luxury. Capra was full of contradictions that he supposedly believed in the little guy, but he had this, as Manny Farber said, a great attraction to wealth in his movies. He loves the trappings of wealth. And Capra, one of the things he lied about that I found out, he told the Washington Post in 1982, "I'm the poorest director you'll ever find." And I found out he had $5 million. One of my best sources was his secretary, Chester Stitch, who'd been with him for 39 years and was also his accountant. And he told me almost everything I needed to know because Capra had fired him after 39 years with 6 weeks notice and no pension. And as his wife said, not even a watch. So
Mm.
he was angry and he was willing to tell me anything. And he said, Capra had 5 million. I actually found the bank records in Capra's papers. He said, $5 million is a lot of money. And then he claimed, he said Columbia had robbed him all these years. He never got a penny from Columbia. And I had a source at Columbia Pictures, confidential source, who leaked me all their financial records on the Capra films. And I totaled him up. He had earned $815,000 in residuals up to the time of my book. And um, that may not sound like a lot today, but it was a heck of a lot of money back then.
Oh yeah.
In 1938, Chester Stitch told me Capra made over $1 million. Can you imagine what $1 million was worth in 1938?
Yeah.
Almost
Wow.
very, he was one of the highest paid people in America. And so he was in favor of the people who were the villains in his own pictures. As one of his blacklisted writers he informed on said Capra was starting to work with the villains on his own pictures. And so he identified with the rich people. And one reason he told me he hated Roosevelt. And I said, why did you hate Roosevelt? And he said, well, because he was a rich kid. And Claudette Colbert told me she had a dinner party once during the 30s, and Life magazine arrived and had pictures of Roosevelt as a boy. And he was wearing kind of long hair like little Lord Fauntleroy, and he had a pony cart and all this stuff. And they were all saying, oh, isn't this cute? And Capra got so incensed that he left the room, and he said, when he was doing this, I was running a paper route. And Claudette Colbert said, what a psychologist could do with that, you know.
Oh
So that
God.
so that was part of it. But I really think what he had against Roosevelt was the very high taxes of the New Deal program. The
Right.
taxes were as much as 90%, which is kind of staggering when you think, I mean, Reagan started drastically lowering the taxes on rich people, but 90% is awfully high. But I can see where he felt, geez, I'm working hard and I only get to keep 10% of my money, and it gets distributed to poor people. And he thought poor people were lazy, and he had all these cliches, you know. So he was not the guy who believed in his films, except that in a sense, I think emotionally he could relate to the characters in his films. There are different levels in people's personalities. There's the conscious level that maybe votes for people, or even that can be influenced by your emotions. But then there's the deep down identification. He could identify with people who are little guys who rebelled against the system, but also these little
Mhm.
guys also had temptations to be rich guys too. So Capra's films
Mhm.
are a mass of contradictions. But the point I was getting to is a lot of people want to believe the myth of Capra, and they don't want to hear the bad stories. So they love the autobiography because it's the fairy tale version of Capra.
Right.
And they don't want. And I've had people say they don't want to read my book. Kevin Brownlow, for example, is a great film historian in many ways. He told Fay Wray. Fay Wray was the star of
Yeah.
Capra's.
King Kong. Yeah.
Yeah, Dirigible. She was in Dirigible, and she was
Oh.
the wife of Robert Riskin, and she's best known for King
Right.
Kong. But she
Yeah.
told she and her daughter Vicky Riskin, who was the head of the Writers Guild, were great sources for me, and loved my book because, I'm giving Robert Riskin his due as the real author of Frank Capra's films. I felt because he was a liberal Roosevelt Democrat, and he was Jewish, and he had come up from poverty, and he was well off, but he never lost his sympathy for the poor, unlike Capra, and a great writer. And Fay Ray told Kevin Brownlow, you got to read Joe's book. It's really illuminating. And he said, "Oh, I don't want to read that because I heard it's negative." And she said, "Well, you got to read it. It's the truth,
Yeah.
And Edward Behrens, who was Capra's sound man, who later became a director, told that to people. He said, "Well, if it's negative, it's partly because of me. I told people, things that are in the book." And he let me use his diaries. He was keeping diaries when he worked for Capra because he was studying him, wanted to be a director, and he wrote down a lot of things that were damaging to the myth. For example, when they were doing Mr. Smith, Capra was shooting a scene at the train station in downtown LA, and some of the extras were kind of dogging it, and Capra turned to him and he said, "These are the people, the ones you want to do something for." And then he writes in the diary, "Some days spilled the load on this, Capra evidently an intense Roosevelt hater." And so I asked Ed about that, and he said, Capra was a godsend to it. I mean, not Capra, Roosevelt was a godsend. He said, "We were working 80 hours a week, 85 hours a week with only Sunday off, and we'd come home and we would sleep because we were too tired to play with our families. And they were working Saturdays until midnight." And he said, we were working like dogs, and Roosevelt came along, and they started having unions in Hollywood, and Capra was against all that stuff. And he said, "It
Yeah.
really hurt me." He said, "It hurt me to hear Capra's anti-Roosevelt talk.
Oh, I
But
bet.
a lot of
Yeah.
people want to believe the false
Right.
story. That's, and it is a very American trait. Somebody on Facebook the other day had a question. They said, "Name one thing America does better than any other country." And some guy wrote, "Myth."
Ha.
That's
Yeah.
a great comment. We love our myths.
Yeah.
That's what the Man Who
Yeah.
Shot Liberty Valance is all about. Ford's
Right.
profound film. I taught a whole course on that last semester. And when the legend becomes fact, print the legend. That's what a lot of
Right.
people would prefer to hear, is the
Mm,
consolatory fairy tale happy version of America, but it's not true. Unfortunately, Capra's story is a great American tragedy.
mm. Well, I mean, it's such a rich story. The making of it, of course, you're frankly unmasking Frank Capra, as well as Frank Capra, the Catastrophe of Success, which last year Joseph was on my show to discuss, and I'll leave the link in the description box if people want to watch that. Where would you suggest people go if they want to get Frankly?
Oh, it's available on Amazon. And I self-published that book. I've self-published 5 books in recent years, which were dream projects of mine that are not the kind of book that you could get a regular publisher to publish, like my book, Into the Nightmare on the Kennedy Assassination. I might have been able to find a maverick publisher to do that, but the mainstream publishers don't do books that are critical of the Warren Commission. Frankly, and I wrote a memoir called The Broken Places, and
Mm,
books that I wanted to put out exactly as I wrote them, without anybody messing with me, especially on the Capra project. I wanted to tell the truth about Janine Basinger and Robert Gottlieb and all the other chicanery that went on. And I poured a lot of autobiography into that book because it's a story of 7 years of my life too. And how does it, and I have a whole chapter on biography at the end of it. How, I'm reflecting on the art of biography and how a lot of people are against biographies that are critical of subjects. Joyce Carol Oates coined this terrible term, pathobiography, which she says are biographies that focus on the negative things about people. Well, Dr. Samuel Johnson, who is the subject of The Life of Johnson by Boswell, said if you're going to write a panegyric, you leave out the vices, but if you're going to write a life, you tell the whole story of somebody, and
right.
that's what I believe. And but it's interesting that a lot of people don't like that. They want
Mm,
the bullshit. But anyway, so I published it through a fulfillment house called Vervante in Utah, which publishes my dream project books. And the great thing is, self-publishing no longer has the stigma it used to have, because many good books are self-published. And with word processing, you can set your book in type and hire a designer. I had a very good designer for these books, and then you deliver camera ready copy and they print on demand, and you control everything about it. And Amazon takes a slice, but it's a reasonable share. And then, but that is the way that anybody in the world can get access to these books. It used to be my first book that I published for the Wisconsin Film Society, Persistence of Vision, was self-published by us, but we couldn't find any bookstores that would sell it. I was naive. I thought bookstores would, take 10 copies of the book, but nobody was interested. But today you can get around the publishing world and the bookstores. Much as I love bookstores, there aren't as many of them as there used to be. But anyway, you can buy it through Amazon, and then Vervante will send you the copy, and that's the way to get it. You can also write directly to the Vervante website online and order the book through there.
Okay, great.
The Capra biography, Frank Capra, The Catastrophe of Success, which I'm very proud of. There was a revised edition in 2000 after I got his FBI files, which took me years to obtain. And I got other files from the State Department and Defense Department, and I wrote a new appendix with new discoveries. And that book is now published by the University Press of Mississippi, along with my biographies of Ford and Spielberg. And I recommend people read that book. Maybe read that book first and then read the other one, or read Frankly first and then read the true story of Capra.
Yeah,
whatever.
you could certainly go either way, because they're two, Frankly is really your story, and the other one's really Frank's story, and a lot. So whichever one people want to read, but they're both wonderfully rich books. So I highly recommend checking them out, and I'll leave the links in the description box to point people to where they can get it. Joseph, thanks again. This was such a treat, as always. So
thank you. Thank you for having me back and letting me talk about. I was just reading, by the way, there's a new book coming out from Harvard University Press called Ellman's Joyce. Richard Ellman was a great biographer. He wrote a biography of James Joyce. It's a classic. And somebody did a whole book about Richard Ellman writing the James Joyce book. And I'm going to read that with. And it said in the description, he said, you don't read very many books where you read about how a biographer put together the book. There are books about Boswell doing his life of Johnson, but so many biographies probably have a lot of stories behind them that we don't know, and they're books that never came out because we never heard the trouble that people suppress books. I quote early in my book, frankly, that Ray Bradbury said there are many ways to burn books, and this is one book that people tried to burn, metaphorically speaking, and it's an important subject, so I hope people pay attention to it. And in general, also, like West Point's library, that just removed a lot of books from West Point's library, including Maya Angelou's autobiography. I mean, it's just like the McCarthy era, where Roy Cohn and David Schein went around to American embassies and removed a lot of books. And there's been there's a lot of book banning that's been going on in schools in America. And it's a terrible thing. And so I had that in mind when I wrote this book, that it's a terrible thing when people try to stop a book, but I prevailed with the help of an honest publisher, Simon & Schuster.
Yeah. No, you certainly did, which I said is a Capra film unto itself. So Joseph, thanks again, and thank you all so much for watching.
Thank you again, bye.